Now moving on to political topics, the Emirati format. Yesterday in Abu Dhabi, the first round of negotiations with the Russians concluded. The next round is expected exactly 1 week from now. Today, the Western press is full of publications. What should we expect next? What are the biggest challenges? Let's ask our special correspondent in the United States, Dmytro Anepchenko, about this. He is joining us live from the American Congress. Dmytro, breathe. What are the forecasts and expectations?
Well, first of all, the forecast and expectations regarding the timing are more or less clear here. All the negotiating teams are now taking a week to once again coordinate their positions in their respective capitals, possibly adjust them, and then gather again in a week in the United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi. Next. As for the format, I know there were a lot of questions about why Moscow sent this particular negotiating team, and maybe you've seen them too. There were even theories that perhaps Moscow is finally ready to negotiate, since instead of the usual propagandists like Medinsky, who would once again just talk about the origins of the conflict, this time there were military officials, including the head of Russian military intelligence, Igor Kostyukov. However, American diplomatic sources explain this situation with several reasons. And first of all, it's because Budanov is now part of the Ukrainian delegation, so Moscow had to send someone who would be his counterpart, meaning an official with a corresponding position. American diplomats say that the first round, the one in Abu Dhabi that just recently concluded, was deliberately organized in a mixed format, in the format of subgroups, where it was necessary to discuss, among other things, the technical details of a possible demarcation in Donbass. However, I emphasize that the Russian negotiating team present did not have any mandate to make promises or concessions. Their role was purely technical, to discuss matters and then, as they say, pass everything off the chain to the Kremlin so that decisions could be made there. And American diplomats also explained what sets these Emirati discussions apart, the absence of formal frameworks. In other words, negotiators from different sides, Ukrainian, American, and, well, Russian, had the opportunity to communicate without any time constraints or formal boundaries. The negotiations were, in part, direct between Ukrainians and Russians. That's the first point. Partly, the Americans moderated these talks, and partly only some members of the delegation could meet with part of the other delegation, while others would join later. In other words, this lack of formalities, this absence of any kind of protocol restrictions, according to the American side, is supposed to facilitate the negotiation process. As for the results of the first round, to be honest with you, the assessments are quite varied. Well, on the one hand, the American official who spoke to the press described the negotiations, I'll quote here, as productive. And I think you've noticed this too. Lately in Washington, it's very common when talking about negotiations to say that we're close, that everything will be resolved any moment now. Well, just remember that very sweet speech by Vitkov in Davos. It was enough to listen to him. If you believed only him, you'd get the impression that, well, the war would literally end tomorrow. And I actually asked my American diplomatic sources, why is it like this? Why this particular rhetoric? And I heard that here, they believe that by doing so, they motivate the parties to reach agreements faster when they publicly say that everything is fine, that we're moving toward a result, instead of focusing on the differences. Well, of course there are differences, and of course there are problems. At the same time, off camera, a high-ranking official from the American administration told me that, in reality, things are not so simple because of the Russians' tough stance on Donbass. They say that, in principle, the parties have preliminarily agreed to the format currently proposed by the Americans, that is, the creation of a free economic zone, or as it is now called, a duty-free zone, which they want to establish in the areas of Donbass from which troops will be withdrawn. But it is still difficult to reach an agreement on where the boundaries, where the borders of this zone should be. So, will Moscow agree to withdraw from the current front line by the same distance as Ukraine? This is Kyiv's proposal. Kyiv is insisting on this very firmly. Or will they still defend and continue to defend their own vision, their own version? And there's also the question of how, when, and in what way Russia will agree to leave the territories of Kharkiv, Sumy, Dnipropetrovsk, and Mykolaiv regions, if a solution is eventually found for Donbass. And there's also a huge question regarding the Kherson region, because that's a territory the Russians consider their land corridor to Crimea, and they see it as a strategic area. So even now, when President Zelensky said that there's one issue we still can't agree on, and that's the territorial issue, the president spoke about this directly in Davos. So So it's clear that this issue and this territorial uncertainty directly affect both the negotiations and what's happening now, including in Abu Dhabi. Because as long as there are no answers regarding the territories, you probably also noticed that Russia constantly refers to the so-called spirit of anchorage and keeps saying that we need to be guided by the results of those negotiations. What does that mean? I tried to look into it for you, tried to explain it to you. Well, what I hear from my American interlocutors is that, according to internal rumors here in the corridors of American power, supposedly during the negotiations in Alaska, Putin actually told Trump that he would like to gain control over the entire Donbass. And apparently, the American president did not publicly object. The Russian side perceives this as a kind of tacit agreement. It's not a fact that such an agreement exists, but that's how it's seen in the Kremlin. While they're probably taking wishful thinking for reality. And right now, this message, the so-called spirit of anchorage, the anchorage agreements, is being constantly exploited. And further, if we talk about what is happening, the issue of monitoring the ceasefire remains unresolved. At the moment, there's even the idea that two missions might be needed, a monitoring mission and a so-called peacekeeping mission. That is, Moscow does not agree to the deployment of international forces, which the Allies are talking about, along the line of demarcation. In any case, the process is moving forward. In any case, let's be honest, the process isn't an easy one. However, in a week, exactly in a week, two negotiating teams, actually now three negotiating teams, are supposed to meet again in the same place, in the United Arab Emirates in Abu Dhabi. Alexei, colleagues.
Dmitro, thank you very much. With the latest news from Washington was our special correspondent, Dmitro Anapchinto. Thank you, colleague.